So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Josh Howard. I am a PhD student here in the Public History program at Middle Tennessee State University, and I would like to welcome everybody to this public forum, which is entitled From Education to Engagement, Transforming Visitor Experiences. So here today we have three eminent visiting scholars. We have Dave Thelen, and we have Ellen Rosenthal, and Barbara Franco. And I just wanted to give you a quick introduction of how this is going to function this evening. So we will have two presentations, one by Ellen Rosenthal and one by Barbara Franco. Each of them will last approximately 30 minutes or so. And then afterwards, Dave Thelen will lead a discussion and comments and whatever anybody wants to say about these presentations in a moderated way. Whenever you want to speak during this session, notice that we all have these wonderful fancy microphones in front of us, and you have the speak button, which you have to hit to turn it on, and then make sure you hit it again to turn it off, so that we don't have some weird chatter going on. So I've also been charged with introducing the first member of our public forum, Dr. Dave Thelen. So when I was trying to figure out exactly what to say about Dr. Thelen, it was very difficult because he's done a lot of things. He's done a wide range of activities. So also, I am a statistician by trade, so what I did is collected a lot of data, and hopefully that will show you the breadth of the accomplishments that Dr. Thelen has accomplished. First, he has published 63 articles and book chapters. He's presented 156 scholarly papers and lectures, and he has edited or written 9 different books. He has served as a professor, either full-time or visiting, on 3 separate continents before he ultimately retired from the University of Indiana in 2005. He also served a 14-year tenure as the editor of the Journal of American History, which made him the longest standing editor for that journal. He's also received numerous professional honors, one of which being when the Organization of American Historians named the David Thelen Prize after him, unsurprisingly, in 1999, which is an award for the best American history published article that is written in a language other than English. Currently, Dr. Thelen serves as the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University and as a research professor at the Center for Culture and Languages in Africa at the University of Johannesburg. For the purposes of this public forum, though, Dr. Thelen's most directly related work stems from his book, The Presence of the Past, Popular Uses of History and American Life, which he co-wrote with Roy Rosenzweig. This publication generated a wide range of follow-up studies, again, follow-up studies across 3 continents, as well as extensive scholarly discussion of the role of the past in the everyday lives of individuals. The work's importance to public history lasts to this very day, as evidenced by the fact that Dr. Thelen is here on campus at MTSU teaching a summer session on this very topic, as well as the fact that we're all together here in this room with these 3 eminent scholars ready to discuss a similar topic this very evening. So with that, I present to you Dr. David Thelen.
Thanks, Josh. Well, I'd like to welcome you also to what I think is going to be a very exciting experience this evening. I think we've all noticed how history museums are at the center of a challenge that is shaking many cultural institutions and public history. And that challenge has many names and many forms, a little hard to put one word for it, but the title for this session isn't a bad one, The Shift from Education to Engagement. We're looking for something, a move from where curators generated the content, professionals generated the content, and presented it somehow to visitors, and visitors' job was to respond, to react. The initiative from the curators or the professionals, academics, whatever, the response by the visitors. Since sometime in the 1990s, and I'm smiling because we had quite a conversation about this at lunch. Something happened in the 1990s, which I hope this would be a great place to actually investigate and pull together materials that is more clear now than it was at the time. But something happened in the 1990s and took many forms, and it amounted to a shift in the focus from the curator and the professionals as the generator of content to the co-creation with users, visitors, readers, students, hobbyists, communities, the co-creation between professionals and non-professionals in the imagining of the museum experience and in the content of it. What's going on is a challenge that I think is captured in the title of one recent anthology, Letting Go, Sharing Historical Authority in a User-Generated World. And the users are, as I say, every kind. They take every kind of form, from visitors to museums to other places. A couple of years ago, Nina Simon used the term the participatory museum to conjure up what she thought the future of museums might look like, the notion of participation. Well, this idea of sharing authority, as Mike Frisch called it in 1980, sounds, I think, both vague and scary. And the two are related, I think. The vagueness of it also makes it particularly scary. What indeed would our museums look like? What would our worlds look like if we had to share some of our authority with people who had no training in history? If they were the co-creators of content? Well, I think this issue is not mainly one of power or ideology, whether authority should be shared or not. I think the real question is how to do it effectively, not whether to do it. It's an area where practice is way, way, way ahead of theory, in my view. People are doing it all over the place, and they're doing it in all sorts of ways. And they're not doing it by following theory. Theory is way behind the practice. It's more important to take risks than to worry if you might fail. The more people try things out, the more we're learning that our roles are going to be larger in a user-centered world, not smaller. They're going to be different. But this idea of letting go, leaving something vacant, is highly unlikely. I think much more likely is that we're going to have to play different roles, modify the roles that we play. And here's where Ellen and Barbara come in, because no two people have done more to experiment in various ways with generating a practice of co-creation between visitors and professionals. They both pioneered in many, many ways of listening to and incorporating visitor experiences and transforming engagement. Ellen grounded her pioneering work in sharing authority in research in how visitors experienced museum exhibits and developing ways of engaging visitors where they were, not where they were expected to be or where curators hoped they would be, but where they actually were. She did this first in the New History Center in Pittsburgh in the 1990s. She's best known for her work at Conner Prairie Interactive Exhibit north of Indianapolis, Interactive History Park north of Indianapolis, where she has been president and CEO since 2005. In 2005, Conner Prairie transformed the living history world, I think most people would agree, with its opening doors approach to interactions between interpreters and visitors. For me, Conner Prairie is also a pioneer and a winner of many awards for a program called Follow the North Star, in which visitors play the role of fugitive slaves trying to escape to freedom in 1836 Indiana, and then reflect on what that experience taught them about themselves and about shaping their worlds. Now, I first heard of Barbara Franco in the early 1990s when I heard she was doing this very strange thing up in this new museum in Minnesota, in St. Paul. She was requiring curators, before they could curate an exhibit, to talk, to talk to 20 Minnesotans to listen to them. That was in a not practice curator tradition, but listen to visitors, listen to Minnesotans in framing this exhibit. She was in charge of curating the exhibits that were about to open at the new Minnesota History Center, which she did from 1990 to 1995. From 1995 to 2003, she was president and CEO of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., where she pioneered in relations between communities and history museums. From 2004 to 2011, she was executive director of the Pennsylvania History and Museum Commission with oversight over all the museums and other things in that state. And since 2012, she's been director of the new Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. Through all of these activities, Barbara, like Ellen, has been a pioneer in history and museum work. She has served as a past chairman of the American Association of State and Local History Board, and so on. So what we're going to do is they're going to share their experiences, and for about half an hour each. And then we're going to open this up to a discussion. So I'd like to welcome Ellen Rosenthal.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Delighted to talk to you about Conner Prairie. Now, can you all hear me? Can you hear me if I stand here? Yes, okay, terrific. So we debated among ourselves and decided to start with the specific and then move to the more general. So I'm going to tell you the interesting tale of Conner Prairie Interactive History Park from the time I got there as vice president in 1999 until today. And I thought David's introduction about sharing authority was an interesting one, because I think those of us in public history really have come to understand, or I hope have come to understand, that as we are presenting free choice learning opportunities, with the emphasis on free, that we must share authority. We have no other choice but to share the learning. We're not in a school situation. So when did I come to understand that? How I began in 1997 when I was in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh Regional History Center. I was in charge of changing exhibits and had created an exhibit called Shattering Notions about the glass industry in Western Pennsylvania, which is very important. And at the same time, I got involved with a group out of the Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh that was doing very anthropological research on how visitors learn in museums. And as part of this research, we had 4 or 5 groups of visitors go through my exhibit. We tape recorded their conversations, we transcribed them, and then we studied them, deconstructed them. And what I was surprised to find was how little control I, as the exhibit developer, actually had over the exhibit experience. One pair of visitors, a father and a daughter, talked about the father's father who had worked in the glass industry through the whole experience. 4 visitors who were Korean, I had someone in my group who actually translated the Korean, were very fascinated with labor movements. And they talked about everything in the exhibit as symbolic of the struggle between labor and management, sort of the great ideas I had never had in developing the exhibits. So that insight was for me really an epiphany about how much control the visitor has, how much they really bring to the experience, and how that colors their experience. So I came to Conner Prairie in 1999 and brought that experience with me. But before I tell you that, let me tell you a little bit about what Conner Prairie is today. This is a map of Conner Prairie. We're outside of Indianapolis. Today we have 5 history experience areas from the original 1836 prairie town created in 1974. which reveals the story of the settlers to Indiana, to a Civil War area, balloon area that tells the story of the first airmail delivery, Native Americans. It's not really important what we have, except that it's a big campus, 200 acres, with 3 indoor areas. And we rank among the largest segments of museums in America. So we, last year, had 323,000 people who attended. We have a $10 million budget this year. So I just tell you that to put it in the scope. There are lessons that can be learned for every size museum, but some of the things we've done will not be directly translatable. What is remarkable about Conner Prairie is what's happened to our admission, our general admission. This is general daytime admission. And I'm showing you this like the end of a detective story where you get to see who was murdered and who did it at the end. So you know what happens in the end, and now I'm going to take you back and show you how it happened. So the museum was founded in 1974. By 1997, it had hit an all-time low in attendance. Nothing had changed, essentially, for those years, and most of the visitation was 4th grade field trips. When we did focus groups, when I came, people said that why should we go back? Nothing ever changes. They thought that once in a lifetime counted, and the 4th grade field trip covered it all. So we had some major challenges. I will say, you'll notice, and we were not alone, the History Museum field has generally been struggling from its blossoming efflorescence at the time of the bicentennial in 1976, when there was a general heightened interest in American history. If you look at Sturbridge or Colonial Williamsburg, you'll see that the height of their visitation was in the 1970s, and they've been on a downward slope ever since. And Conner Prairie was on the same trajectory. In 1998, when I went to a meeting of a group of the 25 largest outdoor history museums in the country, called the Outdoor History Museum Forum, one of the CEOs said, let's face it, we're in crisis. And the problem is that history teachers in schools have really turned people off history. And we really don't have a choice. We really have a problem. So I had to admit, having moved there, that Conner Prairie had a problem. Not only had it not changed, but I had 3 boys who were a really effective focus group when I moved there. They were 13, 10, and 6, and I took them through, and they said to me, Mom, your old museum was better, and this is really lame. One of my favorite lines was my youngest, when I once, Conner Prairie uses first-person interpreters to present its, to fulfill its mission, and a lot of the first-person interpreters are retired. So I said to my youngest son once, do you want to go out to Conner Prairie with me? And he looked at me, as a kid will want to do, just laid it out, and he said, sure, Mom, let's go talk to old people. So we definitely had a major challenge. So here we are. These are actually images. These are PR images from the 1980s. Conner Prairie was the first American living history museum. Plymouth opened a couple of months after us, and was generally regarded as one of the most authentic museums in the country. By the mid-1990s, by the time I came, in 1999, authenticity had come to matter most. Whereas when it was founded, it was considered this incredibly innovative place that was dealing with history in a new way, where experience mattered. In the intervening 20 years, it became the staff's particular interest in the kind of buttons that were in costumes, whether the costumes were hand-sewn, and whether they were doing things exactly as they had been in 1836. So each interpreter also had to deliver specific information, even though they were speaking in first person. They all had 3 major points to deliver. There were about 18 stations, so they gave about 6-minute monologues. So if you were to go through, you went to 18 6-minute monologues. The interpreters had to guard original houses, and it was mostly 4th grade field school visits. It was sort of otherworldly when I first visited. I couldn't really believe it. I would say things like, this wedding that you do in June, on one day in June, you spend 3 weeks preparing for it. If people happen to see it, it's great, but if they don't, they miss out. Why don't we do the same wedding every day in June? That would be, we can celebrate June as wedding month, and I was told by the staff that can't happen because people only get married once. So we had major challenges, and I was in the vice president's role, so I had some time on my hands, and I thought, what do I do? Well, the visitors, the learning studies that I'd done in Pittsburgh were a real epiphany for me. How about if I bring them to Conner Prairie and see if they can help change the thinking of the staff? So that's exactly what I did. I went back to the Learning Research and Development Center at Pitt. They mentored some studies. I did the studies along with a colleague, Jane Hetrick, and even from a pilot study, what we found was that interpreters really function best not as dispensers of information, but as catalysts for engagement of the whole group or family unit. That monologue actually impeded conversation and learning. That interpreter style and ability to engage was critical. So when we say it impeded, we were looking at a format to measure learning through the conversations that visitors were having, and looking at conversation as both the process and the product of learning, and seeing when visitors got to higher levels of discussion about information they were seeing. So just to give you an example, I could say, the first thing visitors do is say, this is a glass. The next thing they say is, my Aunt Tilly has a glass just like this. And really where you want them to go is to really begin to understand, in 2013, we have plastic glasses. That's a sign of our society today that nothing is real, or very little is real. I'm making this up as I go along. But what we found is that the monologue was impeding. What would happen is people would lecture, the visitor would say, uh-huh, and try and get away as fast as they could. If there were kids involved, the kids were wandering off, and the parents were concerned that the kids were being rude, and they would grab them by the shoulders and make them stay in one place. So we decided that, what we really learned is that the guest is ultimately in charge of what they learn. And that really is that what they learned was really dependent on what they brought into the experience. So I use this cartoon, although just to show that everybody has their own thing in their head that they bring to everything they do. This cartoon seems to be about people thinking about themselves as dogs, so I don't really understand it, but every person's response in a museum setting or an archival setting has to do with what they think of their identity, what their prior experiences are, what their expectations of the visit are, who they're with. And that is a tremendous influence on what happens. So what happened in our learning study? So we did a pilot, and then we hooked up with a sociolinguist at the Ball State University and did a whole formative analysis of 50 families, and then made changes and then went back and looked at what was happening again. We came to see learning in an entirely different way. So if in pre-2001 it was filling a glass, post-2001 it was rolling a snowball. And when we say rolling a snowball, it means that the areas that are already roughened, that are roughened by previous experience or previous learning, by the fact that you're your kids studied colonial America and thought about not having electricity and what that meant, by the fact that your ancestor came from Indiana or didn't come from Indiana, or the fact that you studied the Civil War. I mean, anything that learning tends to cling to what you already know. And I would say it also, then what you take out of the museum visit then goes back and goes on over time to be a sort of a foundation for further learning, particularly for children, I would say, in the classroom. So the Opening Doors interpretive approach was created, and that was to really value guest interest. This was a tremendous revolution at Conner Prairie. So we ended the information dump. We completely did away with post goals. And our interpreters, our frontline staff, had been evaluated on whether they got information across. So we took that out of their requirements. We removed all breakable objects. And I am trained as a curator. And I know you all have learned about the power of objects, or most of you have. Well, in the 7 or 8 years since we did this to remove all objects that had unique provenance, we have not had one complaint about there not being unique objects. We have the capacity to make reproductions. We filled the space with reproductions. We created, and when I say we, I mean not administration, but really after the studies had done, it became a staff problem to try and figure out the solutions. And the staff created a toolbox of both hands-on and minds-on techniques to meet the needs of visitors. They set up environments in the beginning, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And we completely changed the way we trained them. So in the past, they had only been trained in the history. We actually changed the way we hired them, too. So in the past, they had only been trained in history, and they sort of picked up the skills through apprenticeships on the grounds. After Opening Doors, we started to train them in improv, in cultural differences, in developmental stages, and how to talk to children. In engagement techniques, in how to work with the toolbox. It would take us, someone said, do you use volunteers? Mostly we use paid staff because it takes us so much investment to get someone ready to go on the grounds, to really be able to work with a range of visitors with different interests. So when we came back and studied what was going on again, what did we find? So this is showing you before. You're not supposed to read this, so it's really just symbolic. Before, there were monologues. After we made changes, there was one longer stay time, but then there was actual conversation, and not just conversation that was taking place between the visitors, which is what used to happen. They would walk away from an interpreter and have their own conversations, often with their own misinformation. But they had conversations with the interpreter drawing everybody into the family or in the group into the conversation. And you can see after that if the yellow is the interpreter, white is the guest, that they're really having a conversation. And there were also, as we measured higher degrees of learning, they were really moving up in their ability to really think more broadly about what was going on. They were, if you will, learning. Just to give you a sense of this was not just happening with free choice visitors, but with students as well, that the teachers noticed that they had stopped. The students were no longer just getting a speech and moving on, but they were able to participate. We developed hands-on techniques that worked for whole groups of kids where they'd pull against oxen and all sorts of wild things. The staff, in the meantime, created a new mission statement, and I think you can see from here that the old mission statement was to educate the public. So many museums have these mission statements to preserve, to educate, to present. I forget what the triplet is, but our staff as a whole, we started asking each other, what actually is our role? What can we actually do for visitors that come in? First of all, we changed our language, so we now speak of guests. But in the end, we realized when someone pays their money or comes in for free, we can't test them. The best we can do is be the spark, to inspire curiosity and foster learning. That we can do that if we do it really well, and that is our goal. So for those of you who know, Conner Prairie was actually going through a governance dispute during this time. So we had, for all intents and purposes, no board while the Opening Doors was being developed and being implemented. So the staff actually had the opportunity to develop a mission statement, which was great, with just a rubber stamp from a very sort of a symbolic board. And the mantra came to be, put guests at the center. And what I think as the administrator was the most wonderful about this, and when I give talks, is not that this happened, but really that it was became a grassroots movement. So if you went to Conner Prairie right now, and this actually just happened recently, no one knows that I was the first one to do a learning study. They have no idea I was even involved or even know anything about it. This is something the staff owns at this point. This is who they are. It's sort of part of their DNA. It's part of the culture now. And they started to come up with ways, and you know, as Barbara said, you talk to visitors. If you're talking to the visitors, you know what engages people. And they were the ones that started to come up with ideas. So as one of our board members says, Opening Doors is now our secret sauce. Because it's really about what engages people, what brings them into learning in ways that they don't even sort of understand. And I will tell you in general, it works for guests, but what I've actually found is it works for stakeholders, it works for donors, it works for the board. That whole idea of sort of thinking through what engages people, what draws their interest, what makes them want to participate, is sort of the clue to what makes everything work. So the staff developed animal encounters where we actually breed animals for socialization. So it used to be that our sheep were bred and they all gave birth in March before we actually opened our doors. And then the head of agriculture said, you know, I can change that. I can actually breed them so they deliver throughout the season. And I said, do not explain to me how that happens. But he now has had multiple generations of breeding animals that can be touched, that don't get startled by huge groups of kids. And I just have to tell you this because it always makes everybody groan. So if our animals are lambs and goats and pigs cannot be socialized, but calves are very well socialized. If they really do well with people, they get to stay and work with the guests and procreate. And if they don't, we have a wonderful partnership with a gourmet delicatessen downtown. So sorry, it's true, I don't know. Yes, so also another thing a staff member came up with, which I didn't even know about until it was practically in place, was Choose an Avatar, which was a video game overlay on 1836 Prairie Town, where you get to choose your character, and what you see on the bottom is a big wheel you spin, or you can choose the character, and you get to do chores and then move to the next level, and you can earn a token and redeem it at the store. And kids love it. They really love the avatar of the criminal. I don't know why, but it's really. I'm just going to some of the other sort of tenets that we follow is to engage the entire family in memorable experiences. And I've been saying this for years. Whatever experience you're creating, if you want families to be there, if the children aren't engaged, you lose the parents. And I know this from having the frustration of trying to go through a history exhibit with my kids. If they're not engaged, you can't enjoy it. And if the parents aren't engaged, you also lose the children. How long can you stay and watch them climb through a fire truck in the Children's Museum? I wish children's museums would listen to me, but so we try and balance it out. as some of you may know what I'm talking about. We use the Pixar approach. So as Pixar sort of creates multiple layers, we think through what the learning objectives are. This is actually the new 1863 Civil War journey, which is the incorporation of first-person interpretation and some technology. And it was incredibly difficult, but we worked through it so that it worked together, so a family can go in it together, and they all can take things away, then they can share the experience and talk about it together. And we've overheard some wonderful conversations between parents and children about some really weighty issues related to war and the attitudes of Hoosiers, of people in Indiana, towards the Civil War. So it's been very rewarding. Engineer your environment. Think through what ways will engage different ages. That applies for museums, archives. Think through how you set things up so there will be hooks. Prioritize guest comfort and need. This goes without saying. And then David would never forgive me if I didn't say something about Follow the North Star, which is a program which was developed in 1998 before opening doors. The evening program is for ages 12 and up. And as I said, we use age-specific programming judiciously. So Follow the North Star is an adult program. It runs at night. We have a daytime program for middle school students. It is such a powerful program. It's sort of the epitome of the museum experience that tells you more about yourself, as much about yourself as it does about the historical moment. And so we keep it going even though it loses money. But it's so mission-centric that, and the daytime program, we cannot keep up with the demand. We just keep expanding and expanding and expanding the amount of time we devote to it. We have installed special kids areas because it feeds membership. And the other thing I would say, as you're thinking about public history, which we think about, I mean, location, location, location. I'm talking about families and children because that's where we are. We're not in a tourist destination. We're in an area that has tons of families with children. And we made a deliberate decision that that was going to be our core focus, that we wouldn't survive focusing on adults. You may decide that you can survive if you're the Hermitage and you have huge tourist audience. You can focus on adults and get away with it. We would have not survived. So we pay mind also to the latest research on what children's gender and age preferences are, and I refer you to a wonderful research by PGAV at pgavdestinations.com. We work variety into the visit, create a symphony of experiences because it is variety that keeps learning fresh. Even if you love mashed potatoes, if you had an entire meal of mashed potatoes, you would be sick of it by the main course. And it's the same thing with first person. We've deliberately changed up the kind of experiences, and Barbara, I think, can confirm in exhibits too. You try and change up the view, the thinking, so from animal experiences to storytelling to hands-on. And then, as I said, consider who's coming to your site. Always see from the guest perspective and adjust accordingly. And that happens on the micro level and it happens on the macro level. And the last thought, how do you and your staff think about learning? This was actually the biggest obstacle to overcome at Conner Prairie, was to get to the staff to understand, as Yeats said, my favorite quote, education is not filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. To them, education meant sitting at a desk and learning so you could take a test. When we suggested that we loosen that up, they said, but that's not fulfilling our mission. So to get them to see learning in a whole different way was a huge campaign and a major undertaking, which I'm happy to say we've come out on the other side of. So thank you very much.
Well, it's great to be here with you in Tennessee, and When David invited me to participate in his class and in this public program, he asked me as well to sort of think about and tell how I became involved in issues of public engagement in museums. And that was a harder question than I thought it was going to be. And as I thought about it, I realized that I didn't have a kind of quick, ready answer to say, oh yes, and it was that day, and then that's how I got involved in it. It was much more complicated and a longer journey than I imagined that it had been. So I'm going to take the time that I have with you this evening to just kind of walk through that journey, and it's partly for my own benefit because it was interesting to see how some of the ideas that we've been talking about originated, when they originated, and sort of how this all happened. Just to kind of look about how I turned from someone who started out as one of those curators interested in the stuff of history, to someone who instead was becoming a student of how people interact with history. So I started my career as a decorative arts curator in a historic house museum. You can't get more typical than that. And one day, this was in Utica, New York, at Fountain Elms, which is a Victorian house museum. And I was very immersed in collections and research and cataloging and doing some exhibitions and writing catalogs. And my aha moment came when I was sitting in my workroom putting teeny tiny numbers on teeny tiny doll furniture for the doll house of the family that lived there. And suddenly I thought, what am I doing? Who cares that these, I took such pride in the fact that the numbers were legible. Who cares about that? And suddenly it really occurred to me that my job might be to put those numbers on, but that wasn't enough. And that unless someone cared about that, there was really no reason to have these collections perfectly cataloged and described and housed in the right boxes. And so that really became, for me, a point early in my career, thank goodness, that there needed to be some other purpose to this work than just cataloging objects. Not that it isn't important, it still is important. About the time that I was asking myself these questions, science centers were moving in a new direction, away from systematic collections. So in the fall of 1969, Robert Oppenheimer opened the Exploratorium in California, and Taizo Miyake opened the Ontario Science Center in Ontario. What's amazing to me is that these were two projects, both very innovative. Neither of them were aware of the other, and yet they came up with startlingly similar conclusions. The Exploratorium defined sciences not as a set of facts to learn, but as a process that visitors participated in and actively explored. And the Ontario Science Center was based on the Chinese saying that I hear and I forget, I see and I believe, I do and I understand. Both of them designed exhibits that required and encouraged visitors to interact on many levels. So there was floor staff, explainers, object theaters that sort of involved theatrical and objects, experiments in the gallery. All of this brought new, fresh ideas to the museum world. I mean, these were revolutionary ideas for science museums as well, because if history museums were stuck in collections, natural history museums were really grounded in systematic collections. So in retrospect, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's science, that's interesting to people. But that wasn't the case. And so it was almost more revolutionary for, I think, science museums to move in that direction than history. But move they did. In the 1970s and 1980s, I was working in a history museum in Lexington, Massachusetts, sponsored by Scottish Rite Masons, that was called the Museum of Our National Heritage, which was doing changing exhibitions with borrowed collections. It was kind of a history gallery, which was itself a kind of an odd idea and innovative in its own way, that we didn't have deep collections and we had to borrow and partner with people. We began experimenting with interactive elements partly in response to these new science museum models. It looked like they were getting a lot of visitors, and maybe there was something we could learn from that. The first of these experiments was an interactive gallery that accompanied a very, very traditional British Library exhibit on the famous voyage of Sir Francis Drake for the 400th anniversary of his 1578 voyage. We looked at this and thought, well, these are just wonderful, rare objects, but it was very traditional. And we thought, you know, people really in Lexington, Massachusetts aren't really steeped in British history. How are we going to make this understandable? So we came up with the idea of doing a second interactive exhibit along with this. So the first thing we did was to go and talk to our friends at the Boston Science Museum and say, how do you do this stuff? What's important? One of the things that they told us was, if you want people to move, you need to have something interesting that they can look at. I mean, you have to use their eyes to actually get them to move around. So the resulting hands-on experiences included try-on costumes, breakaway costumes, I found out they're called, you know, the Elizabethan things. It was very interesting, with mirrors. A game of chance, pirate or patriot. So you had to spin like a roulette wheel and to see what he did and to decide whether this was he a pirate or a patriot. It was a little of both. A recreated ship deck. What Drake thought he would find, which was on the top. And then there were little sort of more like peepholes that you looked in, what he actually found. So you had to discover things. And then my favorite, which was a peephole that you looked through, and then you saw yourself in either on an engraving, a painting of either Queen Elizabeth or Sir Francis Drake. It was interesting that we decided to do a separate gallery. We obviously couldn't mess up this traveling exhibition from the British Library, which was very elegant, but it was very cerebral all by itself. I mean, frankly, we did not know what we were doing, but the experiment was a success. People of all ages loved the interaction, and they spent more time and attention with the traditional exhibit than they would have otherwise. It's interesting because I think we did the try-on costumes always thinking, oh, well, children will love this. And my favorite memory of that exhibit was seeing a middle-aged man and his elderly father trying on the doublet, you know, because it gives you a completely different shape, and putting a cape on and saying, "What ho, Sir Francis," in the mirror, in the middle of a gallery. I mean, it was wonderful. In fact, the years that I spent in Lexington doing those exhibits was really a tremendous education, because temporary exhibitions turn out to be a wonderful medium for experimentation and for risk-taking. A lot of times history museums are really hampered by the fact that we do the permanent exhibit. And the exhibits are so expensive that you only get to do it once in a lifetime, or twice in a lifetime, that changing exhibits are harder to do. But to actually specifically say, okay, let's do something quick and dirty. What can we learn from that? It's such a different experience to try something when it's only going to be up for 6 months. How bad, how much trouble can you get into? I mean, if it's not good, you go on to the next thing. And that's exactly what we did, is just to be able to try something, and then if that worked, use it right away in the next exhibit. If it didn't work, find out what didn't work and be able to move on from there. It also allowed us, what we did after that, and I want to mention pick up on what Ellen said, is the first experiment we did was to have a separate exhibit, like a children's exhibit separately. But after that, we began to put interactive elements into the mainstream of the exhibit. And part of that is so that there's something for kids to do and adults, and that they can go through together. And later, when I was working in Minnesota, we were going through the similar discussions and thinking, oh, should we have a children's area? And there was something that the head of Disney had an editorial, and he said, families like to do things together. And I said, aha. Why would you have a separate room where the children are playing and the parents are bored? Why not work it into the whole? So we really had some fun doing that. It also, having these changing exhibitions, really allowed me to do what I love to do, which is to observe visitor behavior. I think that the anthropologist in me really, I think there's nothing more interesting than just wandering around the floor of a museum. I mean, even now when I go to museums as a visitor, I'm still fascinated by watching other people use the exhibits as well. So I began to notice that when some exhibits, some things always worked, and I started asking myself why. And I began to think about the fact that if we were designing exhibits for basic primate behavior, they were always successful, regardless of age or content. So bear with me here. Primates are curious. So if you hide something, 100% of your visitors will look at it. If you cover something, they will pick it up because they have to. They can't help themselves. So flip books, lift up kinds of things are just this. You see them in science museums, they work in history museums, they work everywhere. It's just a behavior. We can't help ourselves. Try on costumes. Primates like to look at themselves. We are self-aware. The peepholes that I mentioned are work. I mean, that's something that you can see on construction sites in a city where people have to stop and look. Well, the same thing in exhibits. Games. One of the things we learned very early on with the Pirate and Patriot is lots of times we have interactives or people but they're just boring. And people, primates, humans, we like to play games. We're playful, but we like there to be some payback. There needs to be something that you learn a skill, that you learn something. There's got to be something that you get out of that interaction in that game. And the last thing is that primates primarily learn through social interactions. And I have to say that I was able to test these hypotheses some years later at an AAM meeting when we actually did a session on primates in the gallery, and the other people on the session were two primatologists who actually agreed and talked about, it was really interesting to hear them talk about primate learning, which is primarily visual, good for museums, almost always social, and that naturalistic learning is about this free will learning, and that one of them had a chart which showed formal education and naturalistic learning, sort of what is in sort of traditional societies and that sort of thing. And it turns out that museum learning is much closer to that traditional society learning, where it's you are learning in a social situation from someone who you trust, you're in a family situation, rather than formal learning. So I think there's something, some really interesting things to think about there. I have to say, when I look at a family in a gallery, what I see is a hunting-gathering group, actually a gathering group. Has anybody ever picked berries? Okay, what happens? So the youngest children range out and go find, and then they come back and say, oh, look, here's this, here's this, here's that. And it's exactly the way families go through galleries. So really thinking about what do people want to do and what feels comfortable for them. And I mean, it sounds, it's kind of weird in a way to think about it in that way, but really there are things people like to do and that feel comfortable to them. And when they feel comfortable, they're much more apt to be learning. Well, about the same time as I was observing people in galleries, other people were doing this in a much more serious way. John Falk and Lynn Dearkeen were pioneering serious work in visitor studies. And the museum experience, published in 1992, provided objective analysis of their observations and surveys of museum visitors. And I know for many of us it changed the way we thought about the museum experience. What was going on with visitors was much more complex than most of us had imagined. Visitors brought a lot of their own experience with them. They took away unexpected outcomes. They were interested in the social interactions and the physical environments. And I think one of the things that came out of that study, which again was that museum visitors do not come for learning as their primary goal. Their primary goal is a social experience, to be with family, to be with friends, even to interact, but it is very much a social experience for them. We've been chatting about the 1990s, and one of the reasons for that is that as I began thinking about how I kind of got serious about the idea of the visitor experience and what we could do in exhibits to really enhance that experience, I realized that everything sort of kept coming back to the 1990s. And I was talking to Bob Beatty, and he was saying that there was a lot of stuff going on with AAM and other studies, the visitor studies, a whole range of things. And at that point, I had moved and was working at the Minnesota Historical Society, opening the new History Center there. And it was a very interesting time to be starting a new state history program, because there was all this new theory that was swirling around, which we wanted to take advantage of, and we wanted to figure out, well, how do we put this into practice? Visitor research was a major component in that period of time, and as David said, we really took it seriously in putting together the exhibits there. The project one of the things that we did is to work on doing visitor research to find out what were people interested in. So, for example, one question we had was, did we have to explain to visitors that there wasn't just one narrative, one official narrative of history? And this was a question that people were talking about at that time, the official narrative versus multiple perspectives and multiple narratives. And we thought, well, we're going to really have to spend some time making sure that visitors understand that. Well, when we actually did the visitor research, we found out people knew that already. And it was really a lesson to know what is it that you need to think about, and what is it that people need to know. What do they know already, and why would we waste a lot of time and energy telling them something that was really already apparent to them and that they were there already. One of the things that we did, which really was helpful in terms of getting staff to come along with thinking about new ways of treating our exhibits and our programming, was that we had a consultant, but then it's very expensive to hire people to go out and do surveys and interview people. So we actually enlisted our staff. So everyone on the staff had to go out and do a certain number of surveys. And these were out at shopping centers, not in the museum. We wanted to find out what people who didn't come to the museum thought and what they were interested in. And my favorite story of that is that one of our designers was very, very shy. Very introverted, but he had to do his interviews. So he was out on the street, and as you know, when you're doing visitor surveys, it's like, okay, the third person that walks over this line is the one you're going to interview, so that it's completely random and you don't get to pick who you talk to. And so he watched two people go by, and the third person that went by was a group of bikers with tattoos and leather, and so he walked up to him, he was a very slight person, and said, would you have a high interest in visiting a new, Minnesota History Center? Well, it turned out they did have a very high interest, and it was really, he came back and told this story to the rest of the staff, and it was really an opener to say, you can't judge or think about who is interested. You can't decide that this person is interested and that person not interested, that there were always surprises, that visitors were not going to be able to be put into little boxes. And it really opened up that the people that we saw visiting, we had to have a lot more respect for them and their interest in what they might bring. Another piece that was going on at that time was sort of new ideas about civic engagement, community engagement. Jack Chen's article, Creating a Dialogic Museum, was published in 1992 and talked about his ideas of engaging community members in using personal memory and testimony to inform historical scholarship in the New York Chinatown History Project in New York. Similarly, Ron Chu described his experiences as director of the Wing Luk Museum, which was changing the role of the museum in relationship to its community. And he described that as from an inward-looking citadel into an active town hall. And this really excited a lot of people in terms of how communities could become more engaged and involved, especially in museums that were talking about community history instead of thinking of it as a commodity that you would save and create and then give back to the community, that it would be something that would be actually created with the community. Throughout the 1990s, the American Association of Museums made museums and communities a central initiative. And several mainstream history museums, the Chicago Historical Society, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and as well as the Pittsburgh Heinz History Center, all experimented with community-based history exhibits that struggled with issues of insiders and outsiders. How do you, as a curator, go into a community and work with that community? Who's in charge? Who gets to set the agenda? Who gets to have the say of the final product? Who shapes the story? And these multiple voices and contested identities really were something that mainstream history museums were looking at other more either ethnic or racially specific museums who were having much more success with this. But we thought, well, we should try this too. But each of these projects really concluded that working in this dialogic way with communities required endless meetings, facilitation skills, diplomacy, and unlimited time. A new set of skills and a new way of working for historians and museum staff. And it's interesting because few of these individual experiments and these exhibition projects were repeated or permanently changed the museum's approaches to public history. It's interesting that in that period of time, history museums sort of experimented with that and then backed off from it. Now, that is not to say that community museums don't exist, but and the ones that are sort of from the community have continued to be successful and certainly to continue to be created. Oral history is another strain that certainly has influenced a lot of museums and museum exhibits. When I was in Washington, we did an exhibit that was based just on oral history. It didn't start with collections at all. We basically looked at 100 years of Washington, D.C., the city's history, and took decades and interviewed people who were growing up in those decades. And what we did was, because it's D.C., is we paired, it be diverse of men and women, white and black. And what was really interesting, and then they shared family photographs, sometimes artifacts, and it was a small exhibit, but it was really based just on the oral histories. And the programming that went along with that was very interesting as well, because we had then community dialogues about some of the participants and then others. But what it really, the incredible process and the programming for this that resulted was of having people who had grown up in Washington, D.C., in a segregated city, compare childhoods that were perfect mirror images and yet never intersected. And so one of my favorite parts of that was that when we did these interviews, white and black Washingtonians from, the 30s, 40s, all talked about how important their neighborhood movie theater was because it was air conditioned, for one thing. But those movie theaters were segregated, and they were completely separate experiences, and yet the same experience when they came together again. And in these public programs, we had people sharing those stories and realizing we had the same childhood, we just had the same childhood separately, which was a very, very moving and very, I think, changing for people to really understand that that they had so much in common and yet had never really been together during their childhood. So it was an interesting way to talk about segregation, but not because we were talking about segregation, but just through the stories of real people. The whole issue of memory, and we talked a little bit about that, and certainly some of the work that was done by David with the Journal of American History, and has really sparked a whole new area of historical research on the study of memory and history. And we were talking at lunch today that in some ways that has become one of the points of intersection for academic and public historians, which I think did not exist before. It's become a common ground. And it's also a place where you can't talk about memory and not talk about and with the audience, because those memories are what people are doing and forming. So they are, your audience, your visitors are part of that story as well. One of the things that we learned from audience research at the Minnesota Historical Society was that people who had an emotional experience had a better overall experience in the museum. So one of the things that we started out to do was to have a theater, actually an object theater. And I have to say that this came full circle because the exhibit designer that helped open the Minnesota History Center had actually trained and studied with Taizo Miyake. And so he brought some of those science museum ideas into the History Center. So we started out, and honestly, when we were talking about the theater, which was called Home Place Minnesota, our goal was to make people cry. Now, that you don't often hear that in history museums, but we thought, well, we wanted people to have an emotional experience. And Garrison Keillor was the narrator. It was about finding a place. It was about immigration. It was about all these things. And people did cry. It moved people in an emotional way. And later there was an audiovisual object theater, which was in an exhibit on families that was about death. And honestly, there was a table with Kleenexes because people routinely cried. And it was not about necessarily the story they were hearing, but again, about themselves, their own experiences, making those kind of connections. So why was that important? When we did the visitor research, we found that people who had gone to the theater and experienced the theater got more out, had better retention of information, had a better experience across the board. And we also realized in our research that if people could make a connection with someone from the past, an emotional experience, it also opened them up to taking in more complex ideas and analysis than if they did not. So really thinking about emotion and empathy as a very, very strong part of a museum exhibit has some very interesting ramifications. The other thing that we also had a set in Minnesota came up with when you're starting a new museum, it's just like, it's a complete open, you've got a blank slate. So you can really think about things in ways that it's hard to retrain or redo exhibits. So one of the things that we also came up with was the idea of then, from this research, that we wanted people to make a connection between their experiences and the experiences of people in the past. We weren't really interested in them learning everything there was to know about Minnesota history, but if we could just get them to make a connection, that's really what our objective was. The second thing we told ourselves, we had, a conference room, we had papers up on the wall, we're going to do, the wonderful planning phases of an exhibit. The other thing we put on there boldly was the visitor is in charge of their own experience, which turned out to be very easy to say and very difficult to do. So let me give you an example of what happened. The first year we opened and we had school groups, and so we gave the information to the leader of each of the little groups when the school groups broke up, and it was a disaster. It did not work at all. So we came back and we regrouped and said, what happened? This was terrible. And we said, oh yeah, the visitor is in charge of their own experience, and that works for school kids as well as the individual. The next year, every kid got the information. And then what we saw happening on the floor was these groups would go out, and the students started helping each other. Oh, I found this, did you find that? There was all this social interaction going on, which never happened when the group leader was saying, and now we're going to go here, and now we're going to go here. So we learned from that, and we realized that we had to really stay on top of that, because our first impulse was always to say, we want to control this environment, we want to control this experience, and really letting go. I mean, that was really an example of letting go. And letting people of all ages really have that chance to explore and own it. So sharing stories, community empowerment, personal engagement with history, engaging visitors in experience, these have all been giant steps forward in making museums more engaging places to learn. But I always have to ask myself, is that enough? I mean, is that where we're going to end? Have we gone as far as we need to? I think the experiments in Minnesota were successful with the public. We were able to do research. But looking forward, I really think that museums need to keep seeking opportunities for even deeper engagement. And it's interesting that I've followed marketing trends and studies. I always like to read things that aren't in our field, because I think they tell us a lot that we can then use. If you only read things that are going on in museums, it's interesting to see what's going in parallel universes. And one of the things that I was reading was that the experience economy was a big buzzword a few years ago. And some people are beginning to talk about the fact that the next thing is the transformation economy, that people are actually interested not just in experiences, but experiences that transform them. Some of the examples that were given were things like health clubs. It's not enough just to exercise, but you have to exercise to be healthier, something that has an effect on you that changes you, your diet, changing your life, that this is a part of what people look for these days. So I think one of the reasons that the idea of dialogue in museums, these conversations that we have with people, are so important is that transformation really is part of that dialogic experience. The Art of Democracy was a project a few years ago that was done by the, the Americans for the Arts. And as part of the report on that project, there was an essay on the art of dialogue that pointed out that the work of Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, who was one of the originators of this whole idea of dialogic and dialogue, saw the goal of dialogue as responsive understanding and believed that dialogue always meant change. So while historians are probably will rarely say that our work is to transform people. The idea of dialogue in museums, of getting people to have a conversation, to have those kind of interactions, does leave people changed in many ways. I was recently listening to a Radiolab segment on NPR. I am now commuting 40 miles, so I really am up on a lot of things. And they were talking about how human beings establish a sense of personal identity. And the answer from the brain scientists was by telling ourselves a story about ourselves. So we are really just, our whole identity is a story. And if you have one story and you can replace it with another story, you're transformed. Or if you acquire a new story, you are transformed in deeper ways, I think, than we often will admit. Stories allow us to feel empathy, compassion. I also, and I think that this is, it's interesting because there was another article that I read about looking at can compassion actually, can you get better at it? Can you learn it? And he quoted the fact that the Dalai Lama contended that individual experiences of compassion radiate outward and increase harmony for all, assuming that acts of compassion have the power to change the world. And he actually thought, well, that's interesting, and he wanted to try an experiment to see how that worked. And he found that this series of experiments tested whether the experience of compassion toward a single individual can shape our actions toward others. The study's results suggested that if we make an association with someone, even something as simple as tapping in unison, we increase our capacity to feel empathy and compassion in that situation and beyond. So I think there really are ramifications for the work that we do, and the ability to connect to a person in the past, connect with a person in a museum, to have these kind of social experiences, and that maybe it's not so such an impossible task. The work that I'm doing right now is at the Gettysburg Seminary Ridge Museum, which is a new museum that will be opening July 1st, which is the 150th anniversary. The museum is located in the historic building that was there on the seminary at the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And the exhibits really reflect the experiences and what happened in that building. So there's one floor that talks about the first day of the battle. There's one floor that talks about the care of the wounded, because it was used as a field hospital. And because Adams County was a border county, very involved with issues of slavery and the Underground Railroad, and it was a seminary, and still is on a seminary campus, to talk about the role of religion during the Civil War. And one of the things that we're finding by looking at these in the exhibits there is the floor on the first day of the battle is a fairly traditional exhibit. It has maps and timelines and artifacts and some murals depicting the battle scenes. The third floor uses life cast figures to set up scenes from the hospital, but they're in the actual rooms where that would have happened. And the second floor then deals with issues of faith and freedom, sort of ideas, and the war of words that preceded the Civil War. And what I have actually observed as people go through is that the floor on the battle is kind of what they are expecting, and it's factual. The third floor, I've actually seen physical changes in people that we've brought through on preview exhibits, where the emotion of dealing with the numbers of wounded, the kinds of things that happened, the stories that the nurses told of what they saw, actually physically changes people. I see them change in front of my eyes. And by the time they reach the second floor, where we're talking about these ideas of religion and freedom and intellectual and questions of why, they are in a much different place than they would have if they had started there. And so, again, thinking about this idea of a museum that can actually be transformative in terms of the experience is something that we're going to be looking at. One of the things that I wanted to share with you, two stories of preview visitors, which we talked a little about. One was, again, thinking about what people bring with you. So we had one preview, and it was a group of people who were Civil War buffs, and there was one contingent who were from Texas, and they were going through and looking at everything, and they came to the very end, which is a mural that looks at the kind of the aftermath of the Civil War, of reconciliation, remembrance, reconciliation, and renewal, and ends with a photograph of Barack Obama's inauguration as the first black president. And this fellow from Texas looked at it and said, "Oh, I'd love to get a copy of this." He said, "This is great." And there was one photograph that showed a school desegregation scene, the march in Selma. And he said, "That really brings me back." And he proceeded to tell me a story of growing up in Texas. His father owned the grocery store. He was sitting on a porch tossing a football, and 3 school buses drove up. And this was court-enforced desegregation, integration. And he said every pickup truck in town, including the Methodist minister, was there saying the most hateful, horrible things you could imagine. And for a long time, nobody got off the bus. And he said, finally, a 5th grader got off the bus and walked across the street and came up to me and said, "Do you want to play football?" And he said, that fellow is still his friend, and they watched together as Barack Obama was inaugurated and cried. So the idea of what that mural meant to him was completely different than what someone else would, and it sort of, it just tells you that this whole idea of recognizing that our visitors come with so much that we need to really honor that and be able to allow them to contribute that, share that, or whatever. And for him, probably telling that story in that place with that mural in front of it was important to him, which reminds me that when we were in Minnesota, and when I worked in Minnesota and we were looking at people on the floor, again, retraining people not to think about telling us the information, but really learning to listen to our visitors. And sometimes what visitors need most is a chance to tell you about their grandmother, and to tell you that, because that's really a part of their learning experience as well. I want to just say on the other side of it, we had a visitor who came through, and at the end of it was kind of seemed a little disoriented, and our education director said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "What gives you the right to make me think?" Which, I mean, I couldn't even begin. I don't go to museums to think. And on one hand, that was troubling. We hadn't met her expectations, obviously. On the other hand, I was sorry I wasn't there, because I would have said, yes, we have no right to make you think, but we do have that responsibility. And to really think about how do you judge success? And in a way, what she said was a great gift to us in terms of helping us understand what was going on with visitors, because one of the goals that we've set for ourselves is not to convince people to believe this or that. We're talking about religion, we're talking about both sides, arguments for and against slavery based on the Bible. but just to get people to think. And so for her to say that what had given us the right to make her think said maybe we were on the right track. I think there are caveats in terms of this. How far are people willing to go? I think we can't be prescriptive. It's interesting, there was a recent report by Britain Thinks that was done for the Museum Association in Britain. Just came out March 2013. And one of the things that it showed was that museums, that people in Britain think that museums, see museums in much more traditional ways as preservers, educators of children, and we're not really interested in museums as civic forums and debate, and that was not attractive to them. So I think there is a fine line between engagement and advocacy, and that's something that we have to be careful about as we go forward. People don't want advocacy for a specific position, perhaps. And I'm just going to end by a quote from one of the people in this study who said, "Museums shouldn't be political. They should stimulate thinking and be informative only. Just tell us the facts and let us make our own minds up." So I think that I started thinking about museums as and exhibits as experiments. I still think they are very interesting explorations. And certainly as working with opening a new museum in Gettysburg, I see it as another experiment with museums learning at least as much from the public as they learn from our exhibits, and that is a continuing learning laboratory that is what makes museums so interesting.
So, lots to talk about. Who wants questions, comments?
I'm Angie Stern. I'm a PhD student. I am in the class with Dr. Thelen. I have a question for both Ellen and Barbara, and comes from our class discussion about how do museums create a feedback loop so that what is coming from the public gets taken in by the institution, and then you can make changes from there.
Barbara wants to go first.
Sure, I'll go first this time. I think that audience research and staying with it, it's not just doing it one time, but constantly being able to go back. There's lots of different ways, and any kind of research is what question you want to answer. So a lot of times museums will say, well, we did audience research. Well, you need to figure out, it's not just a questionnaire, I liked it, I didn't like it, that sort of thing. I mean, to really get deeper, you have to really think like any other research project about what it is you want to learn. And if you really think about your museum as a learning laboratory to say, what is it you want to find out from people? So I mentioned before that, you know, when we were doing the exhibits in Minnesota, we wanted to know whether people thought there was one official narrative of history. Turned out they didn't. Another example of that was we were working on an exhibit on Minnesota families, and we started calling it Minnesota Families. Well, we went out and talked to the Latino community, we talked to the Black community, we talked to some of the other ethnic groups in Minnesota, and they had a very negative reaction to Minnesota communities because they assumed they were not included in Minnesota communities. And so we dropped Minnesota and it was just called communities. That was the kind of information to learn, which was very valuable, and to be able to put right into it. The other thing we did a lot of in Minnesota was prototyping. I mentioned about experiments and temporary. Well, if you're going to do an interactive, we did mock-ups, we put them out on the floor, we took them outside the museum and tested them with other places. And especially if you're doing a permanent exhibition or something that's going to be long-term, the idea of spending some money on that kind of upfront research and testing is really money well spent rather than getting something done and then saying, oh, well, we don't have the money to fix it now, so we'll just have to live with it, which really happens oftentimes. So I would say that thinking about that as a continuous study is really the best way to do that. There are other places, and now, I mean, well, social media is the talkback board of, of our dreams. If you're really following what people are saying about you, that's a great way to find out. And that's what they're telling their friends. We never could listen in on that before. Now we can. So I think there's it's not just one way, but lots of different ways.
And I would say, and I'm just going to be, I can't do anything else but be honest. So in the best of times at Conner Prairie, we actually had a staff member, it's expensive, who was out on the grounds all the time and who talked to people and would present narrative as well as doing surveys. And that information was in every staff room. It went to the executive team, and it was responded to. We all discussed. And then the recession hit, and the position was cut, we thought temporarily, and we filled in with secret shoppers and online testing. So secret shoppers, you can hire someone to come in every week, and then that information was shared with the public. I have to put in a pitch for AASLH, which, what's it called? We do visitors count. You can participate at very low cost in their program where you actually survey, and it's compared in a broader scope. We do that now to sort of just get a general handle on how we're doing and how we look in comparison to similar organizations, and that is shared with all staff. I think it has to be not just the top level, but continuous. But in my ideal world, I would love someone on staff who can, I think you want your staff to go out and talk to people. I try and do it as much as I can, but when times are tough, as they are now, and everybody is stretched as much as you can, it is hard, and it has to be a priority, and it actually helps to have someone on staff who's a real champion, who reminds everybody, so right now it's more piecemeal than I would like, but the important thing is that, in fact, if it's not shared with our frontline staff, they complain about it because they want that feedback. They want to know how they're doing. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Other comments, questions?
So I am not a public historian. I'm a regular old historian and a user of museums. And actually, it's kind of interesting to connect some of the theory that you were talking about to some of my experiences. I actually had the honor to visit the Robben Island World Heritage Center in South Africa. Cried the entire time. But one of the things that struck me in reflecting on it later, all of the docents there are former political prisoners of Robben Island. And so as they're telling the story of the place and of South Africa, but also these terribly personal histories, as the door closes and he was recalling, what was said to him on the day that that door closed, and when his father applied to come visit with him and was shot the day that he applied to. And one of the things it led me to wonder is, what is this museum going to be like 50 years from now when that generation has passed away? And how do you maintain, obviously it changes over time, but having had that experience, it's the type of thing you want everyone to have a similar type of experience. But what happens with museums as sort of generations change, and when you have the opportunity to have people who lived those historical experiences And then those people obviously go away as the museum changes over time.
Well, I'm working right now in a museum that's based on events in 1863, so I think we have no living, although there are living reenactors, but no living people. And I would say that, and the exhibit is called Voices of Duty and Devotion, and it is based very much on personal accounts and quotes from people from that time. And I have to tell you that stories and narrative are extremely powerful. Now, there's nothing that is going to replace the power of having a survivor or someone who has been through that tell you that story. But those stories have power well beyond. And the emotional kind of responses that we're seeing in the museum as people are going through for preview tours is really based on the stories. And some of them are read with voices, some of them are just on the wall reading, but the story itself has power. And so I think that narrative is a very strong and potent way to communicate.
I had a boss once, and I'll quote him, his name is Richard Rabinowitz, who's been a powerful voice in this field, and he used to always talk about furnishing the imagination. So I have always found that although the narrative that comes directly from the person is the most powerful, that particularly for adults. Now, I'm going to tell you for adults. I mean, I think it's much more difficult when you're talking about family audiences together, that kind of narrative is the most powerful kind of interpretation you can have. I remember years ago going to the Edison homestead in New Jersey, and they had a tape recording of his daughter. And they just carried this tape player through the house, and you heard her voice. She was long dead, but her voice saying, "I can remember when Papa," or whatever she called him, Dad, came home, and we would always hide under the piano, and you'd turn and see the piano, and then we'd jump out at him. But her storytelling combined with that place is just or if you've gone to, what is it? So called the Middle East. That's not the Middle Eastern Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Eastern State Penitentiary, which uses the same kind of narrative. There's just nothing more powerful. So I agree.
Okay, I work at two very small museums, and they both really need to implement some of these changes, but I'm at the very bottom. Is there any advice you could give me, any way I can present this?
We talked about this at lunch, and I think we decided that you shouldn't let hierarchy stand in your way. I mean, we didn't talk about you, although. But you was symbolic of I've always gotten ideas into my head and then figured out how to accomplish them. And at Pittsburgh, I decided we needed to do more audience research and set out getting the funding and then getting it done. I was a chief curator, wasn't in my, so I'm not saying you can do this, but I think to help your CEO or whoever you're working for solve problems. And what are their biggest problems? Probably visitation and fundraising. And if you can point out to them what they can do to solve some of these problems, my concern at Conner Prairie is certainly with the learning and the impact. It so happened it also dramatically increased our attendance. I think that's sort of a given. But
well, I think that we were talking about history organizations, in particular museums in general, being risk averse, and how do you create change. I think there's two ways. I mean, if you're I've seen institutions that are changed by sweeping change that is like revolutionary, and then there's incremental change. I think sometimes finding partners to do things can be interesting. Making an offer people can't refuse, and bringing some new resource through a project can sometimes be a way to implement some new ideas. It wouldn't be okay for just to do it on your own, but if you've got someone else that's interested in it, or you can partner with another organization to do something. So maybe there's a way to do theater in your place. Well, to try to say, well, how would we put together a theater program? But somebody does theater somewhere in your community, and to find a partnership where someone might say, oh, well, that would be really interesting for us to do. And partnerships kind of attract money. So sometimes there's ways to, it's not always a direct route. Sometimes you have to, sort of zig and zag to find a way to get it done.
I guess the other word is, this is sort of very trendy, but lean in. If you've read Sheryl Sandberg recently, I think there's really some wisdom in being willing to be confident in what you know and to bring that to the table. I never got fired. I probably came close to it, but
Thank you.
good luck. And look, you've met us. You can call us and we'll help you.
Yeah, but you guys are confident, and you come off as you've done all these things. How do you sort of start? How do you, I don't know if anyone's having this kind of problem. Is it just getting started in doing this?
Well, a good place to start might be the French Resistance. What can you do underground? What can you do behind the scenes? Be subversive. It's.
I think you've got to have a passion. So I was really taken with a passion for visitor research. I really felt driven. I spent 2.5 years working for a history consulting firm, and really was just astounded by how little museums were that we worked for that were connected to their public. And I felt a passion about it. I wanted to learn as much as I could, and I felt driven. So I guess it's got to come out of, for you, if you don't feel it, it's got to not be change for change's sake, but change you believe in, that you think will make a difference. That's corny, but there were other things I could have done that I just didn't feel as passionate about. So.
Ellen, you talked about how the budget is now $10 million. How has that correlated with the increase in audience? Is there a direct correlation? Or is it partnering with such things as the orchestra, or getting grant money, or the Earlham money getting out?
Earlham. So this is for administrators, this is going to be interesting. For the rest of you, you can check your email. And the way our budget is constructed is that we're large. Contemporary has only been independent for 6 or 7 years. And before that time, we were largely reliant on our endowment, the return on our endowment, which was controlled by another entity that controlled us. So now, since we've been independent, we've been trying to wean ourselves off of the endowment because it puts you in a very vulnerable position should the stock market fall like it did in 2008. So the increase in our attendance has been dramatic and has helped tremendously, but it has not offset the drop in our, what we would have gotten from the endowment. So our endowment, our budget is 10 million. Our endowment fell from 116 million to 72 million. And we are still feeling the impact of that because of the way it's calculated. So we have increased earned income dramatically through increase in attendance, and we're driving up fundraising as well, but not fast enough to offset the drop in the endowment. So those two lines are unfortunately met at a crucial point. In about 2008, we'd only been independent for 2 years. So this is much too long an answer, but it's sort of the crucial formula if you're going to run a museum or an archive or anything, of balancing out those factors. And does that explain it?
It does, but I'm also wondering about partnerships. Has working with the symphony, contributed money, or just raised your profile, bring more people in the door?
So Conner Prairie has a 30-year partnership with the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, where their summer home. Right now, we're a partnership, but we mainly just receive rent. So we net about $250,000 a year, which is a good fallback position. This is, quite frankly, a long answer, because we are just as well. We'll talk about it, but the partnership has been great for us because everybody in the community, and we did market research, Conner Prairie is better known than the Pacers, believe it or not, or was. And does everybody know who the Pacers are, a basketball team? So, but it's not clear in people's minds whether we're the symphony or whether we're the museum. The fact that we've grown attendance shows that we're making tremendous progress in that. But the partnership has been kind of a double-edged sword. So,
what about the gift shop? Does that bring in much money, sort of selling of history quite literally?
I'd be interested to hear Barbara talk about the gift shop, which we now talk about as cultural merchandising. Because it's part of memory making. Really, seriously, it's part of the whole shtick. Our gift shop it does not do tremendously well, and that's in part because we are very locally based. Our attendance is very locally based. Tourists spend a lot more at museums than people do who are going there 3 times a year, where they get used to saying no to their kids. You can't buy something every time we go. So it does okay, but it does not contribute very much to the bottom line.
I'd say most museum shops are, if they break even, that's good. I don't think there are some places, I think art museums do well. It depends, and again, if you're a tourist area, it's depending on what the subject matter is too. But it's interesting because I've also come to the same conclusion that shops are not just an add-on, and they're not just about shameless, selling of history. But they're really something that if you listen to visitors, it's something they want. It's the first thing the bus group asks when they get off the bus: where is the shop? And so in meeting visitor expectations, it is an experience that visitors expect from a museum. So even if you don't make money, you have to have it because it would be seen as something that wasn't there. Let me tell you a funny story. When we were opening the new Minnesota History Center, there were 2 spaces in the lobby. One was set aside for the museum shop, and the other was going to be a members lounge. And I said, but the museum shop was really a little smaller than what was needed, and I said, you need to take both those spaces and get rid of the members lounge. If you have a public place, it's a membership organization, but that's exactly the wrong messaging. If you're trying to get new people to come that haven't been there, the last thing you want to have in your lobby is members lounge. This says, this is for some people and not for others, not the messaging you want. And I said, shop says, come on in. Everybody's welcome. If you've got $1, you're just as welcome as the next person. So in many ways, our shops are our most, oddly enough, are in many ways the most open and welcoming place that we have. So because people know how to shop. You don't have to, you know, they're very comfortable with that. They know how to do that. And it makes them feel at ease, again, to feel, okay, this is an experience that isn't foreign to something. Museums are something that's close to my experience. So I see museum shops as a piece of that, of really reaching out to our visitors. So whether they make money or not, really, they should break even.
I actually have another interesting thing. This wasn't the question you asked, but about shops. I'm just going to tell you something. About 3 years ago, Conor Perry joined with the Indianapolis Children's Museum on the Access program, which is a special program that gives a special membership, and for $1, anybody on public assistance in the state of Indiana can come in. And we served about 20,000 people last year. I now get complaints from people who fall in the middle, who feel that we should be doing something to allow the middle class. I don't know why, that's just a protest. This is an interesting question, particularly about the camp, that feel that our prices are now too high and that we're leaving out the middle class. So I don't know why I'm bringing that up. I just think in terms of shopping, it's an interesting question.
Actually, I'd like to turn that question around to anyone in the audience. Some of you are from, well, Hermitage or Stones River, I don't know where. What's your experience with museum shops?
Actually, our store does generate profit from the Hermitage, and it does generate profit into our operating fund. Now that's been recent. It used to generate revenue. It didn't for about 4 or 5 years, and we've had a turnaround just in the last year and a half. So it's important in a variety of ways.
Yeah, our shop generates some income, but it's not a cash cow, if you would say.
I'm from the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum, and I don't work for our store, but it has been a point of pride lately that it is a very profitable store. But I think it is part of that memory making that you're talking about, that a lot of the visitors, especially our international visitors, are wanting to take memories home with them, either related to the museum itself or related to Nashville or related to some other country music specific experience that they had. And I've shopped in your store recently at the Hermitage, and so I gave you some of my money on a book. Thank you.
We'll tell you, has anybody been to the Guinness Factory, which is a museum in Dublin? Oh, a great look at a sort of an adult museum, an interactive adult museum, really interactive, because with your admission, you get a free pint. And I've never seen a busier shop. So.
I'm with Bradley Academy Museum here in Murfreesboro, and we do have a gift shop, but ours is more like the historical. They like to take something about the history of the museum. It's mostly African American history that we portray with little books, also postcards. We did have a professor from Mississippi that says, you know, we probably cannot pay for the big items, but if you have a postcard, that would go a long way. So we do have a lot of postcards about the history of the museum.
Switching topics here. Back to, Barbara, you had talked about civic engagement as being something that a number of museums and historic sites kind of started going down that path and then really backed off. And I wondered, and when you're talking about maybe what comes next in terms of transformative experiences, it seems to me that that's maybe bringing that same idea back around, but possibly from a slightly different angle. So I wondered if you would expound on that a little bit.
Well, I think that that was and there have been, again, it's been episodic, and so people will do a project and then say that was very interesting, and we learned a lot from it. But the number of museums that are actually carrying that out are few and far between. One of the museums I think that has been working on that and really probably has made that their mission to some extent is the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and that the whole idea of taking that emotional experience that you have and saying, oh, this is like my grandfather, and then taking that into a discussion and a dialogue about recent immigrants that are right outside the door on the street, and helping people to make those connections and sort of continuing the conversation. So I think that they probably are the best example. And again, as one of the models, like Connor Prairie has really reached out to that, to their way of engaging visitors. The Tenement Museum has also been training people. It's very labor intensive though. They have the same issue of you don't have volunteers doing this kind of facilitation and dialogue. It takes training. You really have to use staff that are regular and that have had the training and are willing to do that. So it is labor intensive, and it is a question of cost for some museums to be able to do that. But I think that places that are trying it are interested in pursuing that. And I think that one of the things that we need to look more at, and we were talking about this before, is not only looking at American museums, but looking at international museums. And I think that some of the places in the world where there are difficult issues that people are dealing with, there are new democracies, there are all kinds of civic questions that are going on, to look at how museums in those countries are dealing with those issues. And I think we have a lot to learn by looking around the world and not just at our own examples. So I think maybe worldwide it's more, and we now have to catch up again.
I don't have anything to add, so.
Hello, my name is Leisha McVie, and I'm from Bradley Academy Museum here in Murfreesboro. I wanted to know from Ms. Ellen and Ms. Barbara, and even some of the colleagues here, what type of other products do you have in your gift shops or your cultural merchandising centers that have sold really well? And what do you think that the future is going to bring as far as product merchandising? I know it's going to probably be a lot of holograms, computerized this and that, but what do you see that, kids, adults, the family in general will, grow from that would help them?
When I was at the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, we were getting ready for the Civil War 150th anniversary, and we wanted to do some merchandise and et cetera around the 150th. And we worked with a woman who does merchandising for museum shops. And one of the things that she taught us was that you're not really selling merchandise, you're selling a story. So what she said is, whatever this is, what is the story that goes with that? So you can take a very ordinary object, but if there's a story that goes with it and that it tells, you can attach that story, and then it is distinctive to your museum and is special. So one of the things that we did was to, during the Civil War, with the embargo, the Confederates did not have coffee, but the Union troops did. So we created a little package of Wide Awake coffee and told the story about coffee and the supplies and how they used to trade coffee and tobacco across the lines. So here's something that's a pound of coffee, but it has a story, and now that has some meaning for people. So think about merchandising not just as what sells, it's the story that sells. That's what you need to think about. And if you can attach it to a story that's in your museum, people are going to find that. And I think every museum finds that if there's an interpreter that's making something, people are more likely to, because it is a story that they're going to take back with them.
Yes, I will tell you that our store people always say we wish we could go out on the grounds and sell pottery right where the potter is working, and we could sell nails right where the blacksmith is working, and that we could sell costumes right in the middle of Prairie Town. So we sell all those things, but not right in the middle. We actually have experimented with selling on the grounds, but the other thing, yeah, but they don't like. The mothers are already schlepping too much stuff around. They're carrying too much stuff, so they don't want to carry even more. So we have experimented with that, but we have gone to some interesting lengths. So we have a whole line of, I'll say this for the Hermitage too, for your shop in case you're interested. We have a whole line of children's reproduction 19th century clothes that we make in partnership with the penitentiary system. And when we had a press conference, I never thought I would be on the same podium with the head of the Indiana State Penitentiary System and myself. And I just have to tell you, their motto it's called Penn Products, and their motto is made with conviction. So the costume elements sell really well. The hats, the bonnets that kids can put on, that is transformative. That sort of help them. Parents less so. School kids price point is very important. So the lower price points really go out the door, and it varies on who your audience is, who you're going to sell to. More later. You can always contact us. I'll put you in touch.
And now that you say that, if you look at Jack Daniel's, it's not a museum, but they really do well in their gift shop, because it's all based around Jack Daniel's.
Yes. Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
I was going to touch a little bit on the gift shop thing. We're from the Nashville Zoo. But we all work at the historic farm section of the Nashville Zoo. So our gift shop is, of course, very zoo-centered and very limited on the items that pertain to the historic farm section. But one of the things that we actually did, and this will be the 8th year that we've done it, is we found original family recipes that we put into a cookbook. And like I said, we published it 8 years ago, and we're still selling this cookbook in our gift shop, and it's actually bringing in money that goes directly to the house for upkeep in the house. And we're still averaging about 120 cookbooks a year selling that. So that's, at $15 a pop, that's not too bad. So, it's an easy way. It was a lot of work at the beginning, but now it's a very easy way for us to generate a little bit of income. So.
While you're thinking about questions, I'll just blab for a second. I just wanted to tell you, speaking of sort of meeting guests where they are, I'm missing it, but this year is the second year we're having a program which is aimed. We have a young professionals council, so it's 21 to 40, and they have developed a program called History on Tap. And it takes place this Friday, and it is aimed at young professionals. The grounds are open, and the interpreters love it because they get to deal just with adults. But it is craft brewers come in and they talk about the history. We're going to have a panel and talk about the history of brewing in Indiana. And we have done no advertising, and we have already sold out. We sold out last week 500 tickets, including, I think, 100 VIP tickets. And last year was the first year we did it. Again, no advertising, all social media. And we sold out. We tried 300. We sold those out. We had 75 more people show up. So sort of understanding your audience and meeting them, I just thought, if you're most of you are that demographic you happen to be in Indiana, you're welcome to come.
Well, speaking of demographics and transformative experiences, we're in the middle of a pretty profound demographic shift in this country, where in the decades ahead, the ethnic, religious, racial, cultural makeup of the country is changing. How does that provide challenges for historic sites and museums to provide meaningful experiences for different groups? They're going to have very different understandings of history and memory in the process.
Well, I think that that really does speak to asking about and finding out more about changing audiences. I think it's interesting because it's easy to assume that new immigrants would not be, or new residents would not be interested in the history, and yet if you go to a new place, you're often very interested in that history. And I think that it would be a mistake to assume that new Americans aren't interested in that history. Sometimes they're more interested in it than the people that have lived there all their lives. So I think it's just a question of saying, what are the or asking them what are the questions they have, what are the things that they need to know, how do they feel part of this, how do they feel, and how could their experiences also be acknowledged and brought into that story. So finding common ground on those on thematic things. There are many different ways of customs, of food ways, of different things of sharing, and again, saying that they bring news stories, and that's the news story that needs to be collected and shared. I think, again, it's that idea of a social interaction, a safe place to find out about people who are not just like you, and to find out more about who they are and share those stories. So I would say it would be programming and exhibits that are really based in how to bring those together. I think it's I think it's a huge opportunity for museums, but one that we need to be thinking about explicitly, not just waiting for it to happen.
I think it's a great question, and it's sort of in the sort of range of questions that keep me up at night, and which I think we have to move forward with really deliberate speed. We struggle with that at Conner Prairie because 1836 Indiana was very homogeneous. And as I like to tell people, it's not my history. I'm from New York. I'm not from a rural background. So a lot of people relate to it, but it makes me aware of how much harder we have to work to make the experience meaningful and relatable. I can't say we have all the answers yet. I can say we're actively thinking and talking about it. And as we have thought about the experience as not as a more open-ended experience, as a more social experience, what we have found is that the audience has become much more diverse, because it still is it becomes a quality time, a family bonding experience that goes beyond the specific content, and it becomes generalizable. Is that enough? No, I think we really have to do more, and I don't even want to get into it, but we're moving into another phase that will make us much more useful and interesting to broader audiences as we speak.
I have a question, I guess, with all the personal narratives, the focus on visitors, the increased focus on demographics and things. How do you guys find that your curators and on this side of it are trying to, I guess, hold to some sort of objectivity or sort of, I guess, impartialness to the story that you're trying to tell without using personal or like an attached docent, who lived through the experience, I think is a little, slides it one way, maybe not so much the other way. how do you kind of bring it back to the middle ground for that?
Oh, I guess we can speak together. Yeah. Yeah, I won't take long. And if I understand the question correctly, did I hear you say, how do we preserve historic truth and authenticity while we're still using narrative? And I have to say, I think of our historians and our curators as our truth tellers and our, history meters. I count on them to make sure that our experience is trustworthy. So it can be open, it can be friendly, but it has to be historically correct. And that is their job. They are the watchers and the keepers. And there's a difference between authenticity, I think, between being authentic and being didactic.
Well, I'd go back to what I mentioned before, which was whether or not there was an official history, a narrative, and that the visitors understand there are multiple versions. And it's interesting because if you are telling difficult stories or really trying to get people to look at something, we have to trust our visitors to some extent that they can take two different narratives and look at those as two different perspectives. And that sometimes hearing it from a personal viewpoint, we're all pretty, people are socially aware and skilled. That's some of what our visitors bring with them, to be able to say, well, that's that person's opinion speaking. One of the things that's really interesting to me, maybe it was the 1990s, when was the moment when the voice of the narrator was just really jarring? So if you think about old movies or things, there was the voice of the narrator. And then at some point that just seems so old-fashioned and so out of date. And I think museums are sort of experiencing a similar thing, which is, that museum voice, that how are you writing labels? What does that sound like? The tone of that voice, all of that is very, very important. I think about voice so much in putting an exhibit together, and I react to it when I go through an exhibit. So hearing multiple voices isn't a bad thing. People know how to deal with that. It's a conversation that's going on back and forth. And so as a curator, you're not putting out things that are completely inaccurate or wrong, but if it's someone's memory, it's their memory. That's what it was. Whether every fact happened that way and they remembered it absolutely correctly, maybe not, but that's still part of an account or history. And I think we need to learn, it's again like how to facilitate a conversation about how to bring these various voices together so that it does come to something more than just everybody for themselves, but that it adds up to something, but that we don't always have to be the voice that tells that. And that we need to learn, it's kind of an artistry of being able to make that happen. Sometimes it's harder than just saying, oh, it's just easier to tell it, but how do you get those stories to come together into something meaningful? And that's kind of the art of it, I think.
Well, I will tell you, make me think, so in the Civil War exhibit, which is presented both through first-person interpretation and through technology, through video projection, we actually chose 4 different narrators, not narrators, but 4, we used real people and looked at their memoirs, and we chose them to really be relatable to different members of the audience, and then we also had a lot of different voices expressing different viewpoints. So a teenage girl who comes from an abolitionist family and a freed slave who is talking about what it means to be in Indiana now and his experiences of the event. I'm trying to remember what the other ones are. But we do trust the visitor to understand, as there is now, there are multiple viewpoints. There is, and that to bring those together and understand which viewpoint eventually came out, but that it's not just an omnipotent, omnipresent narrator.
I'm Abby Gosher. I'm a PhD student here at MTSU, and to kind of go back to that sort of question, do you think, and this is probably more of a comment than a question, but do you think that the transition towards using narrators and voices from that time has been a way to sidestep historiographical issues that are political? Like, I know with the Civil War, you have this whole lost cause thing that goes on that's not really based in facts, but it's based on, specific interpretation and manipulation. And if that's an effective way of using, individual narrators to sort of sidestep that whole argument, do you think that that's also a technique that you can use when you have a museum that also deals in extremely political history, like civil rights history or apartheid history, where you're talking about very political events that have first-person narration, but the way that you present that history, people can respond very strongly to it, on a very emotional level for reasons that are not necessarily based on, the facts of history.
Well, remember all the issues with the Smithsonian about Enola Gay? I mean, these are kind of now part of and I think one of the things that I've certainly learned with doing exhibits, and I'm sure Ellen has as well, that when you're really dealing with issues that are difficult, what people react against is the museum saying this is the right way. If there are two people that are not in agreement and you put both of those out there, put them both out there and let people see and judge them and show that there's a difference of opinion. But I think it's that what people in the public react against is the idea of the museum telling them what to think, as opposed to allowing them to look at primary sources in some ways and make some decisions themselves. So one of the things that I have often used as a metaphor is a jigsaw puzzle, and an exhibit is a lot like a jigsaw puzzle. So if you can think of a completed jigsaw puzzle, how interesting is that? It's probably like the most boring thing you have ever seen, correct? Okay, now you just take that jigsaw puzzle and you take 3 pieces out and put them on the side, and most people will not be able to walk by without at least trying to put those pieces in. And so sometimes we just have to give a little space for visitors to step into that, to put the last piece in, and trust that they'll figure it out. It's not that you leave all the pieces in disarray on the table, because that's way too difficult and you're never going to be able, that's too hard to do. But put it part way and leave people a little room to come up to and come to those conclusions themselves. I think that's where engagement really is part of it, and that's where we have to let visitors be in charge.
So I will give you one particular example. So in the Civil War exhibit, it's set in southern Indiana. Indiana is considered the most southern of the northern states, so there were people with very mixed sympathies and ideas. And our characters, this is projected characters, represent a range of townspeople, including the 4 characters that we focus on, that give probably 4 or 5 different points of view. And one of them is a townsperson who is more a copperhead than supporting the government. And he says, so I was in the presentation and watching it, and this guy comes on, I've seen it 1,000 times, and he says, let the South keep their slaves. I don't want this war to happen. And it turned out there was a mother and daughter, an African-American mother and daughter behind me. And the daughter said, "Mom!" She was very upset. And the mother said to her, not knowing who I was, "Dear, that's the way some people thought then." And I mean, there was another character who said, "Father says that we have to fight this war to free the slaves," and goes on. And so there are 4 or 5 different, but it was clear from that one exchange that that mother knew that was just a point of view. That wasn't what we were saying. So does that answer your question?
As the regular historian who started the conversation, I wanted to mention you had used as a point of comparison that maybe history museums were a little behind some of the science museums in thinking about this. One of the things I love about being in the history department here is we have such a strong public history faculty, because I think history faculty, public history students and faculty tend to be ahead of us old-fashioned history professors in thinking about how to teach history. And we're also beginning to think about actively teaching a course in the department now about teaching historical thinking. And as we talk to students about how do you, even with a captive audience, how do you, have them engage with history, really learn the history, care about it. I think we have a lot to learn from public historians, so I'm very thankful for this panel tonight.
That sounds like a segue to thank our panelists for this wonderful session.